Okay, so now I would like to introduce Dr. Greene, who's a fire ecologist and researcher in UBC's Department of Forest and Conservation Sciences. And he's aptly named Dr. Greene. He's also a dendrochronologist and a GIS developer who uses tree rings, computer programming, and fire behavior modeling to understand the interactions of forests and fires. Greg's doctoral research restructured historic forest structures and forest structures and fires to understand how forests and fire regimes have changed through time. His postdoctoral research assesses the efficacy of fuel treatments in community forests throughout the province. He also works with Indigenous communities to develop scientifically rigorous sampling protocols for cultural burning monitoring and carbon accounting programs. So Greg's talk today is entitled From Past to Future, Creating Resilience in Degraded Dry Forests. Just checking to make sure that's still it. And thank you, Greg, for traveling and making the journey all the way from Williams Lake to be here today.
Thanks so much, Marcy. And hi, everyone. As Marcy said, my name is Greene. I'd like to thank the organizers of this event for inviting me here. It's given me a few days off of my computer, which I really appreciate. And it gives me the chance to escape to one of the most beautiful valleys in BC. This is actually where I did my master's, so it's kind of a bit of home for me. So today I'll be discussing some results from my PhD dissertation in the context of fire and climate resilience. There are many ways that my research addresses fire and climate resilience, but I've decided to focus here on the importance of species diversity. In doing so, I'll go from the past to the future, discussing what caused changes in species diversity, what the changes were, and why the loss of species diversity is important. Given the short presentation window, I'm going to gloss over quite a few things, including the fire history reconstructions I did. I'm happy to talk about these after this session. So my evidence came primarily from tree ring samples that were collected from over 2,000 trees located across 20 plots that were randomly placed in dense, dry forests throughout the valley bottom of the southern Rocky Mountain Trench. The study area is within the traditional and unceded territory of the Ktunaxa First Nation. These grasslands and forests have co-evolved with and in response to cultural practices that have been implemented here for more than 11,000 years. The forests here are composed of varying combinations of ponderosa pine, western larch, and Douglas fir. So now I'm going to throw a few facts at you to help frame the discussion. First, fire exclusion began with the loss of Indigenous cultural practices, including cultural fires, when the Ktunaxa were forced onto reserves and into residential schools, starting in the 1870s. Second, and this may come as a surprise and may be some fudged results on the Wildfire Service's part, but they claim to actually contain 94% of all surface fires by 10 a.m. the day after discovery, and this is reported as a decades-long success rate. Essentially what this means is they put out a lot of fires. Third is the historical high-grade logging that occurred in the early 1900s in the trench. Logging in the southern Rocky Mountain Trench was so extensive, they actually cut themselves out of accessible areas by 1930. In fact, this logging is the primary reason why the province has the annual allowable cut. And taken collectively, these three factors are why forests have changed from this to this. Contemporary forests are extremely dense, drought-stressed, and very susceptible to high-severity crown fires. But how did these changes affect species diversity? Let's start with the direct effects of historical logging. In this figure, I've broken the forest into three groups according to species composition, but I'll be discussing averages taken across all the stands that I sampled. Historically, western larch and ponderosa pine comprise an average of 46% of densities and 61% of basal areas, meaning these were big trees. By the 1930s, logging removed 2/3 of stand densities throughout the study area, but clearly favored the largest western larch and ponderosa pine trees, as 94% and 89% of the basal areas were removed. Western larch and ponderosa pine now only account for 19% of densities and 24% of basal areas. It's clear that logging had an immediate and profound effect on species abundance by removing fire-tolerant western larch and ponderosa pine and elevating Douglas fir to a position of dominance across the study area. Next, let's see how each species is coping in these dense stands. This is the average density of snags per hectare for 3 snapshots in time. As we can see, more trees die as stand density increases through time. We call this trend density-dependent mortality, which is known to affect smaller trees in dense stands. Here we see the average percent of each species that is currently dead. Percentages are given for trees across 4 diameter classes, with the largest on the top and the smallest on the bottom. It's clear that the smallest trees are dying in large proportions, confirming the effects of density-dependent mortality. But notice the differences among species. Western larch is struggling. Nearly all the saplings are dead, over a third of the poles are dead, and a substantial portion of dominants are dead. Ponderosa pine is faring better, but over half of those saplings are dead as well. These dense stands are clearly favoring the long-term persistence of Douglas fir. Now let's look at regeneration trends. Here we see the average densities of regeneration per hectare for historical stands on the left and contemporary stands on the right. Prior to 1951, western larch and ponderosa pine accounted for 30% of all regeneration, but now account for less than 0.3%. I observed no western larch regeneration in these stands. If these trends continue, western larch and ponderosa pine are likely to be extirpated from these stands in the future. Let's now consider future climate as predicted by Climate BC. On the left, we see the configuration of Beck zones in 2013, which is the year I started this project. On the right, we see how the Beck zones are projected to change in response to climate in the 2050s. What we're observing is an expansion of the hottest and driest conditions in the valley bottom in dark gray, and an increase in warmer and wetter conditions in the foothills and lower slopes of the mountains in orange. The loss of western larch and ponderosa pine is having and will continue to have numerous detrimental effects on these forests. I'm going to focus on just 3 of them. First, western larch and ponderosa pine are the most fire-tolerant conifers in BC. Replacing them with Douglas fir decreases stand-wide fire resistance and increases susceptibility to high-severity fires, particularly in future climates. Second, given the lack of regeneration, the density-driven stress amongst the trees, and the scale at which these forests are in these conditions exist, if these forests are destroyed by high-severity fires, they're unlikely to recover back to forest. In the western US, large-scale shifts from forests to shrubs or grasslands are now common following high-severity fires. Hotter and drier climates in the future will only compound the situation. Third is a reduction in carbon stocks. Forest carbon stocks increase with species richness. This is because each species fulfills a niche. The greater the number of species, the greater number of niches are filled, which allows for more resources to be captured and stored. I do have a list of recommendations to address these issues, but I don't have time to cover them in this presentation. Instead, I'd like to talk briefly about some of my experiences as a forest and wildfire researcher and what it takes to do this kind of work. I draw most of my knowledge from trees. The stories they tell through trees are absolutely amazing. But I also draw from the scientific literature, historical documentation, ethnographies, indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and expert knowledge. In this project, the anecdotal information from indigenous, local, and expert knowledge is what really painted the complete picture for me. For example, I learned about the extensive logging that took place in the trench from the ex-pipe major of the Kimberley Pipe Band that I used to play with when I did my research out there. His father was one of the old loggers, and he told me about all this logging that happened. A big difference between now and the past is that the questions we're asking are larger and more complex. For this reason, researchers are now essentially data scientists. We have to manage and manipulate massive data sets to get the answers we need. We also have to use new approaches to process the data, including knowledge synthesis, big data, and machine learning. But in my field, we still have to sample trees to get raw data. And I don't think this will ever go away. Contemporary ecosystems are too dynamic and rapidly changing in response to land use and climate change. But who or what takes the samples in the future might change. And love it or hate it, technology is critical to understanding the future, so you must embrace it. Programming in particular is a skill set that all researchers will have to develop, especially as we address larger and more complex problems. I personally think the future is in mobile platforms, and that's where I invest a lot of my effort. And of course, you can never stop learning. At the rate that technology and even society is changing, you can't afford to not be caught up. If you're planning to be in the workforce in the next 10 to 20 years, you'll need to stay on top of the latest and greatest in your respective fields. And for me, drones and AI are probably the most inspirational things occurring now in conservation. Drones are allowing us to collect diverse and vast amounts of spatial data very quickly. And AI allows technology, including drones, to make simple and complex decisions. And obstacle avoidance in drones is a very good example of that. Unfortunately, drones and AI could potentially do horrible things, and think Terminator here. So they are a double-edged sword. Thanks.